The 3 Chorrak enforcers were running, and they were not being subtle about it. Kessa saw them from her duty post at the junction of Market Row and the lower transit artery, elevated enough to watch the whole collision happen before it did. Below her, a Marathi trader named Ovet was trying to run in the opposite direction with a supply crate tucked under one arm, and the kind of full-body sprint that told her he already knew he was not going to make the corner in time. The Chorrak crew was faster, longer-limbed, and they knew the market geometry better than Ovet did. What stopped all of them was the human. He stepped out from a supply alcove at the corridor's midpoint with the unhurried motion of someone checking a delivery schedule, rather than intervening in anything. He put himself at the exact center of the walkway and stopped moving. The lead Chorrak enforcer adjusted his angle to go around him. The human adjusted his angle to match. Not aggressively, just methodically, the way a door closes on a draft. The enforcer slowed. The 2 behind him had to slow to avoid a collision. Ovet made the corner. His footsteps faded. The lead enforcer was half again the human's height and built with the shoulder architecture that Chorrak used for presence before they used it for anything physical. He looked at the human with the particular stillness that on Chorrak indicated a decision being actively computed. The human looked back with something that did not translate cleanly into any of the threat response categories Kessa had been trained to read. It was not defiance. It was not submission. It was attention of the kind that had weight to it. "You are in the way," the enforcer said. "I didn't see any of this," the human said. "Neither did you." The enforcer held that stillness for 2 full seconds. Then he made a small gesture, and his crew turned and walked back down Market Row with all the apparent urgency of individuals who had simply changed their minds. No confrontation, no documentation, no incident. The human watched them go. Then he pulled a small recording device from his jacket, made a notation, and returned it to his pocket without looking up at Kessa's position on the walkway above him. She came down anyway. Kessa had been a Vithani security officer for 11 years and had been posted to Thresh Point station for 4 of those. She had a calibrated professional sense for how confrontations were managed and what their outcomes predicted. What she had just watched did not map cleanly onto any of her calibrations. It occupied a category she had not yet named. "You are the consultant," she said as she reached the lower level. It was not a question. "Doran Selt," the human said. He did not extend a hand, which told her he had been briefed on Vithani contact customs. "You are Officer Kessa. I was told you would be handling my orientation. Your shuttle arrived early." 14 minutes, he said. He glanced back toward the corridor Ovet had used. Is that trader a regular target, or was today specific? Ovet runs supply product from 3 separate wholesalers without contracting any of the Chorrak handling networks. They have been pressuring him for 2 weeks. Does he have somewhere to shelter tonight? He has family in the residential sector. He will be fine. Doran nodded, and the gesture was so unremarkable that she almost missed the fact that his attention had not left the Market Row entrance. He was still watching the corridor the Chorrak crew had used to exit. He just looked like he was not. "All right," he said. "Patrol rhythm first. How many officers cover this section and at what intervals?" She gave him the numbers. He did not write them down, but she noticed his lips moving slightly, which she understood was a memorization technique. She also noticed that his first question had been operational, not organizational. Every other consultant she had worked with had begun by asking about command structure and authority lines. This one had begun by asking about time. They walked the lower market together for the following 2 hours. And within the first 20 minutes, Kessa had the distinct sense that he was constructing something in his attention that she was not yet able to see the shape of. He asked questions with a precision that suggested the answers were already being organized into a larger framework. Not which sections did the Chorrak operate in, but which sections had the highest foot traffic between the 3rd and 4th watch, and which loading bays had permanent staff versus rotating staff, and which corridor junctions had the longest blind intervals between automated sensor sweeps. He was not asking about the Chorrak. He was asking about the station. He wanted the neutral geography before anything else. He made a mistake at the senior traders hall. Kessa raised one hand in the standard Vithani acknowledgement gesture to a colleague across the room. Doran took a half step back and shifted his weight to his rear foot in the preparatory posture that, in humans, indicated readiness for physical response. "That was a greeting," Kessa said. He relaxed at once. No apology, no hesitation. "What did it look like from where I was standing?" he asked. "You do not want me to answer that." "I do," he said. "Teach me the full vocabulary. Start with the 10 you use most often." Kessa studied him for a moment. Most consultants, when they made a mistake in front of a senior officer, managed it by acknowledging it minimally and moving on. This one moved on, but toward the problem rather than away from it. She was not yet sure whether that quality was a professional asset or a particular kind of stubbornness. She taught him the 10 most common Vithani physical acknowledgement and status signals as they continued their circuit of the market. He repeated each one in motion, doing them slightly incorrectly, being corrected without apparent discomfort, doing them less incorrectly the second time. By the end of the walk, he was accurate on 7 of the 10. "The other 3?" she said. "By tomorrow," he said, with the flat certainty of someone describing a scheduled outcome rather than making a promise. Commander Prue met with them that evening. Prue was a senior officer of the formal generation, which came with a preference for documented processes over adaptive ones, and a visible discomfort with the arrangement that had placed a human advisor on station at all. The discomfort was understandable. The Chorrak syndicate had been escalating its presence at Thresh Point for 3 months. 2 merchants had required medical attention after incidents. The standard security responses had produced a consistent pattern. Chorrak operations contracted just enough to stay outside actionable thresholds, then expanded again when pressure eased. The pattern had repeated 4 times. The trade summit was less than 2 weeks away. Commander Prue did not want a 5th repetition timed to an event that brought significant outside attention to the station. "You have no arrest authority," Prue said. "No weapons clearance. You are here in an advisory capacity, and all recommendations must be reviewed by Officer Kessa before implementation." "Understood," Doran said. "I want written summaries, weekly." "Daily summaries if it is useful to you," Doran said. "Or I can flag Officer Kessa directly when something needs immediate attention, whichever is more efficient for your command structure." Prue considered this with an expression that Kessa recognized as a statement being processed, but not yet assigned a category. Daily summaries. Kessa has final operational authority. That arrangement works better for me anyway, Doran said. Prue looked at him again with that same unclassified expression. Kessa said nothing. The first operating rule Doran established came out the following morning. He presented it to Kessa and to Peth, the junior officer covering the day rotation. Peth was 2 years into his posting, confident in the way that people are confident before they have made a mistake with full consequences, and he pushed back immediately. The rule was simple: no intervention in any observable situation until it had been watched for a minimum of 90 seconds. Active physical harm was an exception. Everything else waited for the count. What if someone gets hurt in those 90 seconds? Peth asked. Then we intervene, Doran said. But most things that look like they are about to become violence do not become violence. And if you step in at 30 seconds, you take ownership of a situation you do not yet understand. That sounds like a justification for doing nothing. 90 is a specific number, Doran said. You can argue with hesitation. You cannot argue with a count. Peth looked at Kessa. Kessa thought about the enforcer in Market Row and the quality of attention that had produced a 3-second silence in place of a confrontation. She said nothing. The test of the rule came the same afternoon, in a way that seemed almost deliberately arranged by circumstance. A Chorrak enforcer named Vrak was leaning against the front surface of a dried goods stall, conducting the particular kind of conversation that was less a conversation and more a precise demonstration of where a conversation could go if the other party made the wrong choices. The vendor was a small, older individual whose entire posture had drawn inward in the way that meant fear had progressed past the stage of visible response and into the stillness that came after it. Peth saw it at approximately the 30-second mark and moved to step forward. Doran put one hand on Peth's arm, not a grip exactly, just a placement of weight that said the count was not done. At second 50, the vendor's neighbor, 3 stalls to the left, stood up from her work stool. She was a broad Marathi dock worker who sold hardware supplies and had been at her post every day that Kessa had been observing this section. She did not look at Vrak. She did not gesture or speak. She moved to the outer edge of her stall, which placed her body in the space immediately adjacent to Vrak's position. She was not blocking anything. She was simply there, occupying ground in a way that was technically neutral and practically consequential. Vrak glanced at her, then looked away. At second 80, he pushed back from the vendor's counter and walked on down the row. Doran released Peth's arm. "You cost me the collar," Peth said. "You cost yourself an escalation," Doran said. "Watch what she does with her hands." The dock worker was already back on her stool. She had not looked at the vendor, had not spoken, had not made any gesture of acknowledgement in any direction. The vendor was slowly straightening the arrangement of her goods, moving with the careful concentration of someone returning to a normal task after a suspension. Her hands were open the entire time, not trembling, not clenched, open. "She has been doing that for longer than we have been watching this section," Doran said. "We did not manage that situation. We let her manage it." Peth said nothing. Kessa noticed him put his hands in his pockets, which in Vithani body language was a physical marker of processing something uncomfortable without having decided whether to accept or reject it. She made a note in her daily summary. The pressure incident came 2 days later and was the most precisely timed situation Kessa had witnessed in 4 years of station work. A Chorrak crew of 3 had positioned themselves at the maintenance access junction that linked the lower transit corridor to the primary equipment bays. A repair team needed that access. The Chorrak crew knew the repair team needed it and had positioned themselves at the junction with the patience of people who had run the same sequence many times before. The standard security response, sending officers to generate a documented confrontation, would produce the standard result. The Chorrak would retreat, log the patrol interval, and return when the cycle permitted. The repair team had a variable that changed the calculation, and it was urgent. One of the technicians, a younger Vithani named Solta, was in a full SEAL maintenance suit. Kessa's sensor log showed a yellow-coded SEAL integrity warning. The suits were rated for 12 minutes in yellow status before the lockdown protocol was mandated. Solta had been in yellow for 4 minutes before the access was blocked. Doran looked at the junction schematic on the duty tablet. Then he looked at the section ventilation indicator, which was showing a small but active pressure variance in the corridor that housed the junction. File a formal maintenance report on the ventilation variance right now, he said to Kessa. Official channel, not radio. The timestamp on the report is what matters. Filing that triggers an inspection queue. Yes, he said, and gave the tablet back. She filed the report. Doran walked to the junction alone. He went directly to the center of the 3-person crew without acknowledging the flankers on either side. The flankers watched him with the evaluative attention of individuals accustomed to sizing up approaching threats, and he apparently registered in a category that confused them briefly because neither moved. The center was Grath, a heavy, patient Chorrak individual, whom Kessa recognized from 2 previous incidents. Grath had the settled expression of someone who had run this particular sequence enough times to find it unremarkable. This corridor is going into inspection lockdown in under 3 minutes, Doran said. A formal maintenance report was filed 6 minutes ago and is in the processing queue now. When lockdown initiates, station protocol requires 4 officers to clear and document the zone. Grath looked at him with the careful attention of someone encountering a variable they had not anticipated. When 4 officers arrive, Doran continued, everyone in this junction is on record. That includes a technician in a yellow-coated suit, which becomes a documented safety incident. That includes your crew, who will be documented as having obstructed a maintenance response. All of that documentation goes to summary review before the trade summit. You are a consultant, Grath said. You carry no authority here. No, Doran said. I am only telling you what is about to happen. You are welcome to be somewhere else when it does. Grath said nothing for a moment. Then, how long? Under 3 minutes, maybe less if that grate moves. Grath looked at the ventilation grate, which was producing a low-frequency vibration that anyone with basic station knowledge would recognize as a building pressure event. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he made a small gesture with 2 fingers, and his flankers moved. The repair team moved through the junction. Solta reached the equipment bay with 6 minutes of yellow status rating remaining. Kessa, observing from 30 meters back, with the duty tablet still in her hand, ran the assessment she always ran after any incident resolved. What information had been decisive, what the Chorrak crew had gained and lost, and what the pattern suggested about the next approach. The decisive variable had been the documentation timeline. Not force, not legal threat, just the specific, calculable weight of being on record in a way that created cost before the summit. She had known documentation as a tool for years. She had used it before. She had not seen it deployed at precisely that angle, that quietly, at that particular intersection of time pressure and institutional mechanism. She made 3 notes in her summary and did not share them with Peth. The cargo routing problem took 2 days to properly understand and a single afternoon to address. Kessa spent the first morning briefing Doran on the shape of it. A Chorrak lieutenant named Serev had been operating what was, by every technical definition, a legal cargo coordination service at Thresh Point. The service was expensive by market comparison. It was also slow for clients who declined to use it, unreliable with shipping documentation for non-clients, and associated with a pattern of minor cargo damage that affected only traders operating outside the network. Every individual incident was deniable. The sum of incidents was a squeeze, but the squeeze had no legally actionable edge, and Serev knew it. Doran asked her for a list of every trader on the station who had not experienced documented delays in the preceding 3 months. The list was shorter than she expected. He spent an afternoon mapping which loading bays those traders consistently used. 3 of them used a secondary bay near the residential sector, almost exclusively. The bay had originally been constructed for internal station supply runs. It was technically open to commercial traffic, but was rarely used that way. Its permanent operating crew was Murathi, 6 individuals who had worked that bay for 6 years and had no documented affiliations with any commercial syndicate on the station. Route all trader traffic through that bay for 2 weeks, Doran said. Frame it as load balancing for the summit. The official reason should be boring enough that no one looks at it twice. That removes approximately 60% of Serev's fee base during the summit period. Serev has 2 options, Doran said. Expand the squeeze to a bay with a permanent crew who have 6 years of embedded relationships and 0 incentive to cooperate with a network disruption, or reduce operations temporarily. One of those is easier. You are not dismantling the operation, Kessa said. I am making it more expensive and less convenient to continue at its current scale than to shrink, he said. That is different from dismantling it. But it buys time without generating incidents. That is not justice, she said. No, he agreed. But it is a week of no injured merchants. She did not argue with that. She put the routing recommendation through as a summit logistics optimization, attributed to standard load distribution analysis, and watched Serev's documented fee collection drop by 58% over 5 days. Serev made no documented move toward the secondary bay. The Marathi crew presumably continued their work without knowing anything had changed in the environment around them. The behavioral mapping session happened on the 4th afternoon, and it was the session that shifted something in how Kessa understood what she was working with. Doran had been building what he called a visibility chart since his first day on station, a document that tracked every observable Chorrak member, annotated by who they were near, who they moved with, and critically, who they looked toward before taking any action. The chart was detailed in a way that made it slightly uncomfortable to look at, because it was assembled entirely from information that had always been available to station security. and had simply never been organized this way. He walked her through the logic. The person in any group who moved last was almost always the one with the most invested in the situation's outcome. The person who moved first was almost always the most frightened. The person others looked toward before speaking held actual operational authority, regardless of formal rank. These were not absolute rules. They were tendencies with enough consistency to be useful, and the usefulness was in knowing where to put your attention in the first 2 seconds of any developing situation. Kessa studied the chart and found something he had not marked. A young Chorrak member had appeared in the sensor logs of 3 separate incidents over the past week, always at the edge of the group, always positioned near a secondary exit or a connecting corridor junction, and never once initiating or escalating any action. No name attached to the sensor, ID, just a physical profile and a location series. This one, she said, indicating the ID on the chart. Doran looked. He was quiet in the way that told her he was reorganizing something he had seen before, but had not assessed the same way. "What does the fear scent log show for that ID?" he asked. She pulled the sensor array data. The individual had been registering elevated stress markers every time they appeared in a monitored area for 11 consecutive days. The system had logged it and not flagged it because the readings never reached the individual entity alert threshold. Distributed across 11 days of ambient monitoring, it had simply blended into background station stress levels. She ran a biometric age estimate. 17 by Chorrak reckoning, she said. Possibly younger. "He watches exits before he watches people," Doran said. "Every documented incident, same position. That is not security awareness. That is someone who is already trying to leave and does not know if leaving is possible. You can determine that from sensor data. I can determine it from sensor data that you identified as significant," he said. He tapped the chart. "This analysis belongs to you now. You found the piece I missed." Kessa looked at the entry on the chart and thought about the Marathi dock worker who had stood up from her stool without looking at anyone. People who were in positions they had not chosen kept themselves oriented toward the nearest exit before they oriented toward anything else. It was not a behavior unique to any species. "What do we do with this?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "Knowing is enough for now." The formal objection arrived through Commander Prue's office on the 5th morning and was, in its way, the most complicated problem of the week. 3 members of the station's merchant council had filed a formal complaint regarding the use of a human security consultant at Thresh Point. The complaint cited a documented incident at a different station involving a different human advisor in a different situation, in which an escalation had occurred that resulted in property damage and several injury claims. The citation was accurate. The incident had happened. The council members filing the complaint were not wrong to be cautious about it. The problem was the timing. A formal review process took 12 days minimum. The trade summit opened in 10. Commander Prue presented the situation without editorializing. The choice was voluntary withdrawal or formal review. "Give me 24 hours to speak with the council members individually," Doran said. Prue granted it. He spent those 24 hours not defending himself. Kessa accompanied him to 2 of the 3 individual meetings and observed. He asked each council member what they needed the summit to accomplish. what outcome they were most concerned about protecting, and what a bad outcome looked like from their specific position in the station's commercial structure. He did not mention the formal objection. He did not reference his record. He asked questions, and then he listened with the particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as one of his primary tools. Not performative focus, but actual use. The kind where the other person could tell that what they said would be acted on. 2 of the 3 council members withdrew their objections by the end of the day. The third, a Vithani cargo broker named Isath, maintained the formal objection, but agreed to a conditional monitored arrangement. It was a partial resolution. Doran recorded it precisely as such in his daily summary to Commander Prue. Then he took Kessa aside. Isath has been on Sarev's non-squeeze list for 8 months, he said. Consistent fee payment, no documentation of delays. Whatever the arrangement is, it has been stable. You are not reporting this to Prue. It is not my place to disrupt someone else's private commercial agreement when I do not know the full context, he said. But you know about it now. And when the operational review begins after the summit, you will need to decide how that information fits into what you are building. That is not a clean resolution. No, he said. It is the honest one. The corner happened on the 6th night, and Kessa understood it afterward in a way she did not fully understand it while it was occurring. She was walking the late observation circuit with Doran when he turned into the maintenance corridor of Section 12 rather than continuing on the main route. Not the secondary market access, not the transit connector. The service passage that ran behind the lower equipment bays, accessible only from 2 junctions at either end, with no commercial foot traffic after the second evening shift. She knew this section. She knew what it meant in terms of isolation. She started to call him back. He raised one hand, palm forward, in the Vithani hold gesture that she had taught him on the second day. She held and stepped back into the shadow of the junction alcove, and she waited. The corridor ahead of him narrowed toward a sealed maintenance door at approximately 40 meters. Doran walked 8 meters in and stopped. 6 Chorrak members stepped out from the service alcoves on either side of the corridor. They had been there long enough that the ambient temperature in the alcoves matched the corridor temperature on her sensors. They had planned this. They had been tracking him, apparently, for at least 2 days. Sarev was there, positioned at the exact center of the group, which Kessa now recognized as the placement that indicated actual authority. Grath was off to the left with the contained, private stillness of someone who had been running a calculation since before this moment began. And the young individual from the behavioral chart, the sensor ID she had identified, stood near the secondary door at the far side of the junction. Same position, same orientation toward the exit. The mob had the human veteran cornered. 6 members, 2 exits under Chorrak control, 40 meters of empty corridor between Doran and the junction where Kessa stood. She had her communicator in her hand, and she held it there because the 90-second count had taught her something about the difference between the moment a situation appeared critical and the moment it actually was. You walked in here, Sarev said. We did not bring you. I know, Doran said. Sarev's delivery was level and precise. This was not theater. The threat was specific. Isath's maintained objection gave the council the procedural mechanism to terminate the consulting arrangement. Chorrak-affiliated dock workers would escort Doran off the station as a private labor matter, not a security incident. No documentation, no injury report, just an empty consulting contract and a departed human. And within 10 days, everything that had shifted in the market section would soften back to what it had been. Doran listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he looked past Serev to Grath. "How long have you been running the operational side of this crew?" he said. It was not a question. It was information that he already had, stated in the form of a question. And the distinction was significant. Grath's weight shifted by perhaps 2 centimeters to his rear foot. Kessa, watching from the junction, recorded the adjustment. Serev turned to look at Grath. The 2 flankers nearest Serev took a step back, and it was the step that people took, not when they were preparing to act, but when they had noticed something they had not expected to see. Doran spoke to the room, but kept his attention on Grath. Serev's current expansion is applying pressure to 3 separate non-Chorrak handling networks that have been operating the same territories for years. Those networks have been coordinating with each other informally for approximately 14 days. They do not have a formal agreement yet. A common problem is sufficient for the first stage, and the first stage is all it takes to generate the outcome a syndicate operation cannot easily manage. The quality of silence in the corridor was different from the silence before he had spoken. Serev had been watching the security layer of Thresh Point. Serev had clearly built a detailed picture of station patrol intervals, officer response times, and consulting activity. But a person watching the official security layer watched faces and positions. A person watching exits watched the social layer underneath, the informal coordination structures that did not appear in any documentation because they did not need to. "That assessment may be incorrect," Doran said, "but you have been running squeeze operations long enough to recognize what a coordination response feels like in the stage before it formalizes." Serev's hands were still. Kessa watched them. Then Doran looked at the young Chorrak member near the secondary door. The one with 11 days of elevated stress markers in the ambient sensor log. Death, she had started thinking of him, though she did not have a confirmed name. Death looked back at Doran with the focused attention of someone in the middle of a decision that had been building for a long time. "You have been at every incident on this station for 6 days, Doran said. "You have been in the exit-facing position every time, at every location, without exception. You want to know whether a door exists." Death said nothing. "There is a door," Doran said. "It is not fast. It does not come clean. There are no guarantees attached to it, but it is reachable from where you are standing." Serev looked at Death. Death did not look at Serev. Kessa watched the 30 seconds that followed and understood them as a structural event. Serev had entered Section 12 with a plan built on 2 assumptions. The human would respond with resistance, which could be managed, or with capitulation, which required only patience. The situation in the corridor had become neither of those. It was a distributed weight of specific, verifiable information laid out in a maintenance passage at a quiet hour, and it had shifted the geometry of who knew what and whose position was most exposed in the shift. Serev made a calculation. Whatever the calculation produced, it was not the original plan. The Chorrak members began filing through the secondary door in sequence. They moved without urgency. with the measured pace of a decision being executed rather than a retreat being made. Grath was last. He stopped with one hand on the doorframe, his back to Doran, and spoke in the direction of the maintenance door at the corridor's far end. "What door?" he said. "Station Labor Mediation Office," Doran said. "Independent contractor registration for cargo handling operations. If you can certify 3 handlers, you can operate legally, offer below the current market rate, and have documentation that protects you from operational exposure, regardless of what happens to unlicensed networks." "That is paperwork," Grath said. "Yes," Doran said. "It is boring. It is also real." Grath went through the door. The secondary exit sealed. Kessa walked down the corridor from the junction. Doran had not moved from the position where he had stopped. "You walked in here deliberately," she said. "I needed them away from foot traffic," he said. 6 people in Market Row, and I have a crowd response problem. 6 people in Section 12, and I have a conversation. You could have been hurt." "Yes." She waited. He did not add anything to that. "That is all?" she said. "That was the cost of the approach," he said. "I calculated it as the right trade. I may have been wrong about that calculation." She looked at him for a moment. The maintenance corridor was very quiet. Above them, the ventilation system produced its constant low oscillation, pressure moving through ducts in the unremarkable ongoing work of keeping the station functioning. "Come on," she said. "I want to write the behavioral update before second watch." The days that followed moved with a quality of ordinariness that Kessa had stopped taking for granted. Grath appeared at the labor mediation office the morning after the corridor confrontation and spent 3 hours with the registration clerk. The clerk sent Kessa a message that was factual and visibly confused, asking whether there were any outstanding security flags associated with the individual. Kessa flagged nothing. The independent contractor registration was processed. The operation would not be functional for 6 weeks, but the paperwork existed. Death's sensor, ID, disappeared from the behavioral monitoring logs by the end of the following day. 3 days after that, a new employment registration appeared in the residential sector database. Different name on the form. Matching biometric profile. The employer was a food preparation business that had been operating at Thresh Point for 12 years. Run by a Vithani family with no documented connection to anyone involved in the preceding week's events. Death had found the door. He had walked through it before anyone with the authority to complicate it had noticed. Sarev's operation contracted across the same period. The 3 informal networks that Doran had identified as forming a coordination response moved into the cargo handling market openly, competing on price and on the reputational advantage of having documented delivery reliability. The market did not announce the shift. It simply accommodated it, the way markets handle power changes when the change involves nothing dramatic enough to generate a formal record. Commander Prue called Doran in on the evening before his departure from Thresh Point. The operations center was quiet. The daily sensor summary on Prue's desk showed the lowest incident index the section had recorded in 14 months. "How long does this hold?" Prue asked. 6 months, possibly a year, Doran said. Sarev has resources and patience. The operation will restructure. Then what was accomplished? The summit proceeds without incident. You have a behavioral map of the Chorrak command structure that you did not have before. 2 individuals are outside the network who wanted to be outside it. And you have an officer who has been running independent behavioral analysis on the social layer of the market section and building her own annotation system on top of the framework. Priwu was quiet for a moment. That seems like very small gains for very significant risk. Yes, Doran said. That is usually how it works. He left on the first commercial carrier out of Thresh Point the next morning. Kessa walked with him to the transit hub through the early shift market, which was beginning the particular rhythmic sound of a commercial station finding its daily volume. Someone was cooking something on the lower level. The ventilation system did its low background work. Near the transit hub entrance, a young Chorrak female that neither of them had seen before stopped in the center of the approach corridor and looked at Doran for a moment with the evaluative attention that Kessa now recognized as assessment rather than threat. Then she moved on without speaking. "Sarev," Kessa said. "Sent to evaluate whether I am finished or likely to return," Doran said. "Are you?" "I will return if called. I do not have a strong preference about it, either way." Kessa looked at him. "That is either very professional," she said, "or very dishonest." "Probably both," he said. The trade summit opened 2 days later and ran without incident. The Merchant Council recorded its lowest rate of formal extortion complaints in 4 years. Isath attended every session and contributed very little to any discussion, which Commander Prue noted in a private operational file that Kessa happened to review during the post-summit debrief, and then noted in her own file separately, and then set aside until she had more context to place it in. 3 weeks after Doran's departure, the labor mediation clerk sent a follow-up notification. Grath's cargo handling operation had its first commercial contract, signed with a small volume importer who had been paying Sarev's network rates for 2 years and expressed in the contract notes that competitive pricing was the primary factor. The clerk's note was accurate and faintly incredulous. Kessa filed it. Peth had developed a counting habit. He did it under his breath in the market section, a specific numbered sequence that anyone who spent time with him could identify as a timing count. He did not always reach 90 before acting. He consistently reached longer than 40. He had not asked anyone's permission to change his approach. He had simply changed it after seeing a better one work. Kessa was 3 weeks into her own behavioral analysis project. She had been running it since the 4th day of the consulting period, working from the framework Doran had taught and the additions she had built on top of it. She had not asked Commander Priwa Wu whether the project was authorized. She had not asked Doran for guidance. She had simply started doing it because she understood why it mattered, and understanding why something mattered was the only authorization she required. The analysis file had grown significantly past the document Doran had spread on the duty table. It had her annotations now. It had categories he had not named and would not have named the same way she named them, because the things she was watching were the things she had access to, and he had not. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not transfer as briefing material. It does not live in records or instructions. It lives in the quality of attention that a person develops after enough time spent in environments where being wrong has consistent costs, and the costs accumulate into something that changes how a person reads a room before they know they are reading it. Veterans carry this differently from the way other experienced professionals carry their expertise. not with more certainty, with a different relationship to the gap between what a situation appears to be on its surface and what it actually is when you follow the weight of it. The mob in Section 12 had cornered a human veteran. They had done everything correctly by their own logic: isolated position, controlled exit points, numerical advantage, specific and credible consequences delivered clearly. What they had not accounted for was the 40 years of paying attention behind the eyes of the human they had cornered. They had not counted the exits. He had. They had watched faces. He had watched hands. There are problems that are not force-shaped. The tool that resolves them is not the one you carry. It is the one you have been building through every situation where you had to know the difference between what someone was showing you and what they were actually preparing to do. The veteran did not know this because someone had told him. He knew it the way a person knows anything that has cost them enough to become real. Kessa kept thinking about the dock worker who had stood up from her stool without looking at anyone, about Solta with 6 minutes of suit rating still remaining, about Death walking through a door that had been described to him in a maintenance corridor at the quiet hour of a station night. None of these were large events in the station's official record. They had no incident numbers. They would not appear in any summary forwarded to the regional authority. But they were exactly the kind of event on which the larger, documented things ran the way a station's ventilation system runs on pressure differentials that no one monitors until the day they stop working. She opened the behavioral analysis file and added a new annotation to the social coordination section. She dated it. She saved it. The work continued. If something in this story was worth holding on to, the best thing you can do with it is carry it somewhere it can reach someone else. Stories like this one stay alive because of the people who decide they are worth passing along.